All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's fall seminar series presentation hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is Sabrina Higgins, and I'm the Assistant Professor of Aegean and Mediterranean Societies and Cultures with the SNF Center, and I will be responsible for moderating today's talk. Each year, we invite leading scholars working in different aspects of Hellenic studies to present their research on a wide range of topics on the field of archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek history, as well as literary and cultural studies. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. And if you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I'd ask you to visit SFU's IT services website. Online audience, if we run into technical problems, we will update you in the chat, but please know that this event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. I'm pleased to present today's speaker, coming all the way to us from Cairo to join us, Dr. Heba Abd el Gawad, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Archaeology, University College of London, and she specializes in the history of Egyptian archaeology and contemporary Egyptian perceptions and representations of ancient Egypt. She has co-developed with Professor Alice Stevenson, Egypt's Dispersed Heritage Views from Egypt project, for which she's been selected as one of the most influential 21 Egyptian women in 2021 for her community work in the heritage sector. I hope you all enjoy today's presentation.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming and those who are joining us online. And I'm very happy that I finally made it to Canada. And it's colder than I expected, but I was warned, so I came with the right clothing for it. Alhamdulillah, so all good. So today, and perhaps what for me is important to give this talk here at the university or here in Canada particularly is that I've rarely been in another settler colonial setting where colonialism does play a huge role in how some communities are seen or perhaps totally unseen. And while Egypt or wider Middle East and North Africa are rarely seen within a very settler colonial setting as well, although they do exist within a settler colonial setting, or they've had, but colonialism looks different than what it looks here in Canada, but it's still there. And part of the project and part of the talk today is on a little bit of my own personal and professional struggles with the field and how being trained in Egyptology, a field that grew out of colonialism and being Egyptian as well, has made me feel more or less that I equally, like the acknowledgement that Sabrina has just said, I need to acknowledge that I was trained in a very colonial field that have contributed to the disenfranchisement and the disconnection of my own people, the many contemporary Egyptians, from the production of knowledge surrounding their heritage and the dissemination of knowledge surrounding their heritage as well. And this is perhaps my very humble attempt to do something about it. Usually, how many of you have ever been to Egypt? Oh, very proud. Wow. Just two. Okay. It's been very interesting because in my flight from Toronto to Winnipeg and then to Vancouver, anyone who sits beside me, they would ask me, so where do you come from? When I say Egypt, everyone would say, oh, wow. Everyone is so amazed that I come from Egypt. And the first thing they would comment on is obviously the pyramids, one of the very most well-known stone constructions in the world. And even if you haven't seen the pyramids face-to-face, which I do encourage you all to go and see them face-to-face, but rarely do they look like this, because this looks like a very sanitized, imaginary, exotic image of how the pyramids look like. You would barely get a view of this unless you are on a helicopter or something. That's like practically impossible to get this view. And I'm someone who's grown up all my life in Egypt, in Cairo, and I've never seen the pyramids looking like this, except in a history book or in when I visit a museum, there will be usually display cases with Egyptian objects, and you need to have a landscape image of Egypt as a backdrop in the end. And it's usually a very, as I said, like brushed, sanitized, monuments only image of Egypt that has no Egyptians whatsoever, no communities coming from Egypt whatsoever. Interestingly, this view of the very sanitized, clean Egypt that is only monuments but never people is a view that we have as Egyptians inherited ourselves. And that's a tourism ad that is meant to encourage tourists to come and visit Egypt, part of the official state campaign to increase tourism to Egypt. I don't know if this is also a thing in Canada, but family WhatsApp groups, it's a huge thing in Egypt. WhatsApp groups is a huge thing in Egypt. And usually family WhatsApp group, like there are members of the group in my family WhatsApp group, I've never seen them before. But because they are extended family, we tend to have like really big families in Egypt. And even if you've never seen them, they have to be there in the group. But usually, whenever I see something interesting to do with the heritage or how heritage is presented, I tend to run it through them because I would see it from a very Egyptological eye. My training would make me biased, but they would see it from the very, like, I wouldn't say unbiased, but non-colonially constructed lens, like just the Egyptians. And for them, usually the comments that I got from everyone, first of all, we're not ancient. That's basically what everyone said. Second, we're not all young, which is very true, and young is valuable. Everyone would like to think that they are young, but we don't know what's the definition of young that is used here. And we really don't ride horses most of the time. Rarely do Egyptians ride horses. And the majority of the population doesn't look like these happy people. And we would never say to each other, I'll see you in Giza, because Giza is just one of the bits of one of the neighborhoods of Greater Cairo. I would always, even if I want to see someone near the pyramids area, I would tell them, I'll see you at the pyramids. That's how we would call it to each other. The terminology, Giza Plateau, it's a very archaeological terminology that is rarely used by the actual Egyptians. This is my preferred or my most favorite photo of the pyramids. And that's this is how I would see the pyramids. Many of the Egyptians see the pyramids through a photograph like this. And this is taken by Ahmed Nabil. He's an amateur photographer who tends to post photographs of what symbolic images of what it means to him to be Egyptian, or how does it mean to us to be living in Egypt of today. And immediately, when me as an Egyptian or any other Egyptian see this photo, we could get the symbolism that it used there like very quickly. Usually we're brought up in a way that everything is referred to in the past tense. All the glories that we have are of the past tense. And it's usually the pharaohs, it's usually pharaonic Egypt. And we're never meant to be proud of any other aspect of Egyptian history or Egyptian heritage. And the competition is quite high. Like, how can you compete with the ancient Egyptians, or how can you compete with pyramid builders and mythologies and conceptions that came at the time? So most of your life, you live defeated. You feel that you're self-defeated in comparison to your history, because your present has nothing to do with this glorious past. So you would see yourself as an undergarment. And in Egyptian culture, if you refer to someone, it's not a swear word, but if you refer to someone in the sense of an underwear, that it's very demeaning. You're of a very less level than anyone else. And that's how we feel compared to this heritage, mostly because this heritage is usually not meant to be for us. That's for the tourists to enjoy, or that's for others to have affinity with and enjoy. This is one of also very interesting images of the pyramids. And that is another image which could be common for most of the Egyptians. That's how most of us would see the pyramids coming from the north of Cairo. It's by the photographer Hossein Abbas. And what I like about it is that the pyramids are equally a backdrop, just like in the case of the museum landscape image. They are just the backdrop, but they are the backdrop of the many layers that make up Cairo what it is today, including the people, including the many buildings that might not look as appealing or as attractive as the pyramids, but it is us, it's our life, it is who we are today and how we see ourselves, regardless of what one can make of this. But there is equally another pyramid, which is the pyramid of crisis, and that's the symbolism of the pyramid that was used by Heba Abd el Gawad, one of the Egyptian visual artists and the graffiti artists who contributed to the Egyptian revolution in 2011. And for her, the pyramid is a symbolism of the social injustice, be it the social injustice that existed in the past, because as we know, the distribution of wealth in ancient Egypt was not really very equal, similar to the situation in Egypt today and in many other countries around the world. So for her, the pyramid is a crisis in social justice, in the sense of the non-existence of social justice. And she chose to represent those who come very low at the social strata in Cairo, and particularly the women. And one of them is holding a gas cylinder, because that's a very common scene that you would see in Cairo. It would be mainly the women who are holding the economic and socio-political burden of Cairo. That was the case in ancient Egypt, although rarely this is being told. And it's equally the case in Egypt today and in many other societies. So there is no one single pyramid that is everyone's pyramid in Egypt. We all see the pyramids from a variety of views. And maybe if you're someone who was born in Aswan, in the very south of Egypt, coming from the very low social strata, you would have only seen the pyramids in the education curricula. You would have never came face to face with the pyramids, although you're being Egyptian yourself. Where does this take us? It takes us to the perception of how the image that is constructed of Egypt, be it created through a museum display or even school education or higher education at graduate and undergraduate degrees, not only in the Western European setting, but equally in Egypt itself, it constructed an image of Egypt that is orphaned. So whenever we refer to Egyptian history, that is only pharaonic history. It's quite confined. That starts from the pre-dynastic, prehistory before writing, up till the end of the pharaonic period. Even when Alexander the Great stepped in, a lot of Egyptologists have just stepped out. Like many of the Egyptology degrees offered in Europe particularly, and in Egypt as well, you stop learning anything about Egypt when Alexander the Great, the history of Alexander the Great kicks in. You would be sent to the classics department to know more about the Ptolemaic Roman period, but the core, what makes Egyptology, which is the science of Egypt, is only pharaonic Egypt. And this is what we call the museum effect, but equally the knowledge production effect, that it creates a concept rather than a country, and usually it disenfranchises this concept from the contemporary communities. This is not only a problem that comes with, that's not only an intellectual problem. This is not only a misrepresentation in a history book or in a museum. It does have a serious impact on the contemporary communities of today, because it renders us absolutely invisible. We just don't exist. So if you see me standing in one of the galleries, let's say, in front of a showcase, rarely would people think that I'm Egyptian, unless if I wore a t-shirt that says I'm from Egypt. But apart from that, it wouldn't immediately, because for them, Egypt is this frozen concept in time and space that, like the song Walk Like an Egyptian, that's not a country that is built through continuity and change. One of the reasons that this has happened is that how many of you grew up visiting a museum that has ancient Egyptian collections? Yeah, there will be more people than those who have seen the pyramids, because there is nearly a piece of Egypt in every major city around the world. And this is particularly the case because of the dispersal and export of Egyptian artifacts during the British colonial times between 1880 and 1980. And these are the findings from the Artifacts of Excavation project that was led by Professor Alice Stevenson at Petrie Museum at the time, and currently at the Institute of Archaeology in UCL. And one of the main findings of the project is that the case of the British archaeology, be it the archaeologists or the excavators or even the collectors, it's one of the largest of scale and the scope in the world in the history of all of archaeology. This is the largest scale and scope of artifacts being exported from one source community to the rest of the world. The case of Egypt is very peculiar, is very distinctive. That's why Egypt rests in the imagination of most of the world. It's part of universal history, or part of seen as, or has been domesticated and appropriated as the origins of even Western human history and Western civilization. The findings of the scattered of the Artifacts of Excavation project is in Alice Stevenson's Scattered Finds book, which is open access, and I would encourage everyone to have a read to it. And just it shows how this dispersal of heritage had played a role in shaping the discipline of archaeology and Egyptology, and equally museum displays, because Egypt was one of the very first cultures that initiated what a museum is in the way that we see it today. But when we reflect on the Egypt that we see in museums, the Egypt there, and this is, for example, the case in the British Museum, so you would get a sign that says at the very top, the mummies, and then at the very end, ancient Egypt, and all the other cultures just come in between, like just a sandwich. So your aim of going to the museum would be to seeing the mummies and the ancient Egyptians, and you might happen to go through other galleries in between, which would make me proud. But the problem with it that even in Liverpool World Museum, like the moment that the world cultures goes right, Egypt goes left, and it's never part of a wider human history. It's a very frozen concept. It's not a culture, it's not a country. And that contributes to our invisibility and to how we as Egyptians and the other layers of Egyptian heritage being totally isolated, totally disenfranchised, but equally destructed for the sake of preservation of the pharaonic culture that is of interest to the wider world. Why this is problematic? This is problematic because while people are interested to know everything about ancient Egypt, they have no interest whatsoever to know anything else about Egyptian history. And this is through many visitor surveys that took place in UK museums from the 2000s onwards up till very recently. And usually the responses that the visitors get when they are asked, would you be interested to see any other layer of Egyptian heritage? It's usually very negative, extremely dismissive, and they have no interest whatsoever, particularly when it comes to contemporary Egypt. Would you want to see something from contemporary Egypt? No, that's the straight answer. People were only there to see the pharaohs, were only there to see the mummies. They have no interest in any other layer of Egyptian heritage. Not only is this problematic from a socio-political point of view in making us contemporary Egyptians invisible, but it equally makes ancient Egyptian antiquity some of the most highly prized when it comes to illegal and illicit trafficking of antiquities. So one of the most expensive artifacts that you would find in the antiquities market would be the ancient Egyptian artifacts. And that comes from the world fascination with the concept of Egypt. And that means that we're losing heritage by the minute for the sake of private collecting that takes objects that are meant to be, that have a socio-political, but equally a cognitive connection with the current community that exists today in Egypt, not only for the purposes of research, and you take it out of the public eye forever. And this is highly problematic. What makes it really that we need to discuss this today, or this is a very urgent topic when it comes to Egyptian heritage today, is that currently there is a wave of decolonizing museums, particularly, I would say, in the UK and wider Europe, but maybe the case here as well, in changing how museums display other cultures. And that we need to embrace discomfort more and the colonial histories more. But interestingly, or perhaps ironically or sadly, even when currently there is a call and a rise of the repatriation and the reparation of the African collections and with African communities, Egypt is never part of the conversation because Egypt is never seen as part of Africa. The concept that has been constructed by the museums or the concept that has been constructed by Egyptology, Egypt is the place apart. It doesn't exist within a wider continental, within a wider human history. So, for example, in the Savoy-Sarr report, and that was a report commissioned by Macron, the president of France, to an African scholar, but equally a French scholar, to write a report on the state of African collections in France and how we should move forward to repatriate them. The report did not include Egyptian artifacts, although the Louvre, for example, and that's only one museum in France, has the second largest ancient Egyptian collections outside of Egypt. But there is no talk whatsoever about the repatriation or the need to repair or to even engage with the Egyptian community in France or the Egyptian community in general. Although there has been more recently a few cases where the Louvre has acquired illicit illicit artifacts that have left Egypt illegally. And this has been proven as a legal case, but nowhere do we read or see that there is an intention to discuss Egypt as part of the wider, perhaps European conversation on the colonial histories of museums. The other problem or the other issue is that it's becoming very Western centered, like we are being handed decolonization. Although Egypt, Africa, and many of the previously colonized communities, they have a very long history of anti-colonial activism, and they've been calling for the return of the artifacts for centuries. But now that it became center to the conversation of decolonizing curricula or decolonizing the way Western European institutions sees themselves and sees the world around them, now we're being handed decolonization, we're being offered, kindly enough, the West is offering us an opportunity to decolonize. Third, it's equally very much selective. As I said, there is a focus on Africa, but the case that Egypt is not included, but not only Egypt, when you reflect in North Africa in general, even Algeria and the amount of heritage and even human remains from Algeria that currently sit in French museums, but they're not even in any conversation that has to do with repatriation, despite the very traumatizing history of French colonialism in Algeria itself. But again, North Africa, the wider Middle East, are seen within the framework of the Orient. And within this setting, us as the source communities, we are not seen as indigenous to the land where we live in. We are seen as another settler colonials who happen to be living on a land that for once has housed ancient societies. So we would be referred to as Arabs. And I have no idea what an Arab means. I just know that I'm Egyptian. But what entails being an Arab, this is quite problematic because this is a terminology that was introduced by the colonial powers in the 19th century. And it usually refers to the followers of Muhammad. And not all Arabs are Muslims. That's one thing. The second, it was used equally to differentiate between the progressive West and the savage East. So the Arabs are the barbarians, are the savages, are the uncivilized. So in the Western framework of thinking, they could not be the ones who would inherit this amazing ancient cultures, let's say, of ancient Egypt and the rest of North Africa and the Middle East. One thing that is missing in all of these conversations of decolonization or anti-colonial activism, repatriation, reparation, are the communities, because currently the laws of repatriations, and again, we need to reflect that these laws were engineered in the global north by bodies like the UNESCO, and they were made universal for everyone, but they were not written by those who were previously colonized. So the legalities of repatriation itself and how it's meant to be only state-to-state conversation, and it's only states who have the right to ask for return of certain objects, and it has to occur within a government-to-government type of setting, which doesn't fit with the many minorities who exist, be it in Egypt or be it in the wider African context, making the concept of repatriation, given the policies or the legalities of today, basically impossible to bring the social justice that repatriation itself should be bringing. So what can we do about all of this? How can we resolve this? And part of this was the reflection of how I spent an extensive amount of years in the UK. And the UK is very interesting. I don't know if I can call it interesting, but it has there are nearly 200,000 objects, ancient Egyptian objects throughout the whole of the UK. And these are the ones that are properly documented. There will be more. But there is an ancient Egyptian collection in nearly every city within the UK itself. The case of dispersal of Egyptian heritage in the UK is quite unique. And while I was there for my graduate degree and for the time that I've spent there, I could sense or I could feel that ancient Egypt is part of the British history. It became appropriated as part of British history because it's even part of the curriculum. So they would never learn anything about British colonialism, but in the sixth form, there would be the curriculum that is on ancient Egypt. That's part of what you learn. So ancient Egypt is, but that's only pharaonic Egypt. You wouldn't get to learn the history of the whole of Egypt. You would get to learn the history of ancient Egypt. So it's the rite of passage of anyone living in the UK. That's part of how you see yourself when you grow up, that you see ancient Egypt as part of your being. That was It's something that can bring me pride because I see myself as Egyptian, and to see others prizing my culture in such a way that was quite flattering. But that was an Egypt that is totally without me and without any of the other Egyptians. And it's an ancient Egypt that is without Egypt itself. There is no interest in the communities that come from Egypt. And there has been no attempts because Egyptian heritage within museums, not only in the UK, but elsewhere, it's perceived as uncontested or unclaimed. So for example, even the Egyptian human remains that we know for a fact have left Egypt, particularly when it comes to human remains and body parts, while there were legal laws during colonial times of partage, of the division of finds. But we know from the archival record that most of the human remains that left Egypt have left it illegally. But yet, rarely is Egypt part of this conversation of human remains in the sense of having discussions with the indigenous communities, as is the case with other cultures, be it in Australia or here in Canada or in North America, or even other African human remains that exist in Western European institutions. Ancient Egypt is orphaned, it's uncontested. So how can we use these collections and how can we use these archives in a way that could bring or could contribute to the Egyptian community's lives today in a way that can bring some social justice and social inclusion? But then came the issue, and that was the main question that me and Professor Alice were thinking of. But then there is equally the issue of seeing me standing here, and you would see me as representative of all Egyptians. That's a problem that happens to communities that are made invisible. We are perceived as homogeneous, although we're quite diverse as many other communities all over the world. So there is also the fear of me becoming a token, that I'm becoming the tick box of the Egyptian, the diversity, because, for example, like whenever there is a departmental photograph, they're always very keen on having me on the photograph because obviously I tick all the boxes, like a female, visibly Muslim, Egyptian. So I'm the ethics and diversity and inclusion in your face. That's the proof. So it's quite problematic also for me to feel that how can I do this in a way that I can stay true to myself, but I can also not be complicit in an extractive or an exploitive tradition that has been usually the case? And how can I prove that a single Egyptian is not a representation of all Egyptians? There is a variety of groups, but equally, how can I justify being affiliated to a university that has a colonial history in Egypt, funding that has colonial baggage? How can I make all of this work in a way that is ethical? What we thought of is that while usually research projects are made backwards in the sense that you would identify a gap in the research field, and then you would decide, let's do this project. And then you apply for the application, you get the funding. Then you would go to the community and tell them, oh, we've got this money, we want to do this project here, let us in. This is in itself quite extractive and exploitive, because then the research question that you're asking, it responds to academic needs, but it doesn't respond to the community needs. It doesn't respond to the needs of the people who live just a few meters from the archaeological site that you're interested to explore, or from where an object was retrieved, be it in the 19th century or today. We felt that we want to do it the other way around. So instead of writing the application and then going back to the community, we wanted to do a scoping exercise where we have tried to identify, but we are equally aware that this has its biases, because while we tried to have representatives from each community group, be it the community of practice, interest, or place, but then we are aware that equally a singled out group does not make the whole of the group, but we've tried as much as we can. There is no perfect way of doing it. Then we decided, based on the responses that we got, but equally based on how the socio-political scene within Egypt looked like, because since the revolution in 2011, there has been a rise in the use of social media. It became one of the outlets where people could express openly their views and how they see themselves and they see the world. And there has been part of an identity reflection within social media outlets in Egypt. And comics were quite a dominant scene in it, and usually done by young artists between 19 and 24 years of age, who were able to engage with most of the age groups, and they started a wave in Egyptian graphic comic art, that we felt that if we want to include the communities with us, and if we want to bring some social justice, these could be the artists, or these could be the partners who can help us, or who can pave the way for us to have an open dialogue with the communities that we are interested in in discussing within Egypt. We try to create guiding principles for ourselves. So basically we try to pay our artists based on international rates, because this is equally problematic. When there are projects working with local partners, you would pay them in the local wage, which is usually far less than how much you would pay a scholar from outside. So we try to pay international competitive rates, but equally we were interested in using some local indigenous knowledge, in the sense that while radical transparency is a very Western European way of seeing things, but sensitive transparency, it's something that fits more within an Egyptian African culture, in the sense of we're discussing colonial histories, and we're discussing exploitation, extraction, and this could be traumatizing for some, and this could bring back memories of atrocities, peoples who might have lost family members in the process, because the archaeological archive makes colonialism look very peaceful, and that there has been no memories or lives lost, but the reality of colonialism is far more brutal than what the archaeological archive tend to lend itself to. And we felt that we equally shouldn't be only accountable to the funding body, because that's usually the case. You would need to submit impact reports to the funding body, and usually you would need to have figured out all what you're going to do before you start the project, and what you're going to find out before you start the project. But we wanted to create a more ethical way on how we are equally accountable to the community, but we gave the community agency through our partners, that they were equally accountable to the project itself. When we submitted the project to the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, the project had the title Egypt's Dispersed Heritage, because we had to use a title that could be easily to relate to for our British academic assessors. But then the issue came that when we're moving to Egypt, then we need to think about it, or to make sure that the project is relevant and relatable to the Egyptian community. So we were looking for the Egyptian Arabic wording to be used for the project. And we used the word, which is atharna al-mutgharraba, and it's a word that is quite emotional in Egyptian Arabic. It refers to being forced migration, or being displaced by force. And this was hinting at how most of these artifacts have left Egypt without their will or without their consent, and questioning also the consent not only of the human remains, but of those who have once owned these artifacts, in the sense, particularly that we know from ancient Egyptian texts exactly what the Egyptians want to happen to their belongings and to their human remains, but we haven't been very much acting upon these requests. So we use this emotional word in a way to bring, or to help people think, or to help equally rehumanize ancient Egyptian heritage. And one of the main outlets that we've used was social media, because social media is quite representative of the Egyptian community. Even if you come from a very low socioeconomic group, you would still have access to social media. That's how the mobile bundles operate in Egypt. There would be a separate bundle for social media than internet browsing. So even if you can't afford to have an internet bundle for browsing, you would still have access to Facebook and Twitter. And it's usually Facebook that is more popular within an Egyptian setting. And it's quite representative also of the community, or the wider Egyptian community, from the sense of the age group, but equally gender-wise. So it was quite a way of us to access the multivocality, but it's equally a way to open a dialogue, because on social media, we're posting something, but we're opening the way for people to respond back to us, either through comics, likes, or whatever. And the main artist, or the focus of the bit that is left of my talk today, is the comic series that we created with Nasser Jr. And Nasser Jr., he's an Egyptian comic artist. He tends to produce his art mainly on social media. He's from Alexandria, but like many Egyptian artists, that's not his main job. He's an engineer. He does software coding, and he tends to draw comics in his spare time. But he's quite popular. in Egypt, particularly within the majority of the Egyptian age group, which is between 19 and 24. So we felt he could be the voice through which that we can bring these narratives. We have no idea what we're going to do. And I'll be very honest. We submitted to the funding body the outputs that we intend, but we tried to make it, I wouldn't say vague, but we tried to make it as open as possible to give us an opportunity to be as organic and community responsive as we can. So Nasser and I, we were having discussions. I would be sharing with him archival photographs from the museum partners that we've got. We had 5 museum partners in the UK, from the north and south of the UK. We tried to be as much as representative of the whole of the museum scene in Britain, and equally the Egypt Exploration Society that was in charge of the public subscriptions or of sending British archaeologists and collectors to export artifacts from Egypt. And it was through the Egypt Exploration Society that Egyptian heritage was dispersed from Egypt to the UK and then to the rest of the world. What me and Nasser felt that, first of all, we didn't want ourselves to be the voices of all the Egyptians. We wanted to just state what we think of the archives and the objects that we were dealing with. So the initial thought would be that we would represent ourselves, because we didn't want to be seen as the voices of Egypt. So there would be Nasser on the right and then myself on the left. And in between would be an ancient Egyptian human. And we explicitly had him having few facial expressions, because that was our way to rehumanize ancient Egypt. You usually see them in a very static, and ancient Egyptians were very much into idealistic art. So you might get to lose the human touch with them when you see the frame, how the ancient Egyptians perceived art or perceived perfect proportions for their own mythology. So we tried to bring equally. Nasser is a representative of the community of interest, being an artist. I am a representative of the community of practice, being an archaeologist. And there is the ancient Egyptian, who's a representative of the ancient Egyptians, but equally the Egyptians at large, operating in 3 timelines. That's the ancient Egyptian timeline. And there is the past, which is the colonial history of archaeology, and the present, that is Nasser, which is the modern time that we live at today. And this was the first comic that we released. And this is based on a true story. So all the comics that we produced, Nasser and I, were based on conversations that we were having together on debates that were dominating the scene in the heritage and museum discourse. So, and this is a true story also, not just with Nasser, but anyone in Egypt that I would tell them when they ask me, so what do you do? I'm working on the dispersal of Egyptian heritage. Also, how much of Egyptian heritage is outside? So when I say it's actually hundreds of thousands of Egyptian objects in 27 countries, which is what I'm telling Nasser here, the first thing that people would think about, or the first response from everyone I would talk to, it would be, can you tell them that we want to travel too? I can convert myself into an ancient Egyptian mummy or an ancient Egyptian piece. And this comes from the fact of how, while our heritage is usually very much welcomed all over the world, we are not. Usually Egyptians struggle with getting visas approved to travel to the very same countries that tend to host our heritage. And even if there is an international exhibition, an ancient Egyptian artifact would have no problem whatsoever to travel from Egypt to an international exhibit, but the Egyptians would have so many problems to travel from Egypt to any of the countries that host the very same heritage, to the extent that even conferences that discuss Egyptian heritage, we had 2 cases in the UK in 2017 and in 2019, where all the Egyptian delegation was denied, their visa was refused. Not only that it didn't come in time, but it was totally refused for them to attend a conference that is discussing basically their heritage. That's the extent of how this is problematic, how the invisibility of us and how this disenfranchisement and displacement between ancient Egypt and between contemporary Egypt and the Egyptians does have an impact on contemporary Egyptians' lives today. And this is a piece of art that was made by an Egyptian photographer. Is just trying to signify the amount of paperwork that he has to submit to apply for a visa. And they would ask you for notorious things like the birth certificate of your parents, even if they are not alive, anything that has a proof that you have links to Egypt, that you would be going back. So the fear would be that you would just not go back. You would use the visa as an excuse to never travel back to Egypt. And our strategy this was one of the main findings of looking into the archive or reflecting into the dispersal of heritage. And in making this comic the way we made it, we were trying as much as we can to be relevant to the Egyptian society, because Egyptians being refused visas, this is something that you would see throughout. There are loads of Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups just to discuss people's experiences with the visas and how to help each other on how to apply or to get a visa not refuted, which is quite rare. And we try to be as relatable to the discussions that going on, but equally responsive. And this was apparent from we've got this was one of our most popular comics, and we've got a selection of responses that was just some of it was quite funny, like in the sense of being cynical, which is true that because currently there is a movement of taking Egyptian stray dogs and cats to live abroad while Egyptians are denied visas, which is, I'm happy for the cats, obviously, and the dogs if they're having a better life. But it's just ironic when, as a human, that would make you feel even more demeaning. And that, again, that's the feeling of defeat that I was referred to compared to the pyramids, the underwear compared to the pyramids. That's how we are continuously made to feel. So compared to the heritage that is quite very mobile, we are totally immobile. We are refused everywhere. This came at a time when we released the comics, when we started in the early of 2020. That was equally the time when, particularly in the case of the UK, there were so many discussions of the refugee crisis and how many refugees would be allowed in. But ironically, at the same time that the parliament, for example, was discussing how, or perhaps refusing or diminishing the number of refugees to be allowed inside Britain, particularly coming from the Middle East and North Africa, there has been millions of British pounds pumped into the protection of the culture in the very same regions. But interestingly, the culture that was protected is the culture that the West would have affinity to. That would be either the very ancient, which is seen as the universal human history, or the Greco-Roman heritage. While other aspects of heritage, be it Christian heritage, medieval, Armenian, all of the minorities' heritage that exist within North Africa and Middle East was not offered the same level of protection or the same funding that was offered to the ancient players, to the extent that there was a case, and this is what made us prepare the coming comic, where there was a boat with refugees in the English Channel. And interestingly, a BBC reporter approached the boat in an exclusive interview, asking them what they were doing in the English Channel, which one would think that you don't really need to make an interview with the refugees to ask them what they are doing there. But for me, as an Egyptologist, the only thing I could think of when I saw this interview is that if this very same boat was full of Syrian antiquities, this would have been saved in seconds. They would have been saved in minutes. There wouldn't have been even a discussion whether we should save this boat or not. It would have been immediately saved. There would have been a huge exhibition in the British Museum saying that how we are the beacons of cultural heritage, how we protect the heritage of the world. But when it's the question of our heritage or our lives, usually our heritage wins over our lives. So again, the way we wanted to do it, because we didn't want to reflect on a crisis that is someone else's culture, that is the Syrian crisis. So we brought it to ourselves as Egyptians. And that is a true story, because even Nasser, our comic artist, when we were trying to bring him to the UK, despite of all the work that he was doing with working with archival material that exists in the UK and working with UK museum collections, it was very difficult to get him a visa to travel to the UK. And we only managed last summer in May, because he's never left Egypt, and that was his very first opportunity to travel abroad. But it was extremely problematic. So even after the piles of paperwork, he got initially a refused visa, but then if he converted himself into a piece of antiquity, then the border agent or the visa officer would have been quickly taking him to London without blinking. And again, these are the realities that we are living in. And part of this also is the colonial amnesia that certain disciplines and museums suffer from. So today, when we try to reflect on major figures in Egyptology, let's say Flinders Petrie, who is usually dubbed as the father of Egyptology, as someone who has introduced more scientific methodologies in excavations, etc. And he's being referred to as the archaeologist of everyday life, because most of the objects that he has collected, allegedly small and tiny objects that currently exist at the Petrie Museum. And given the research that has been done on the artifacts of excavation, his interest in the everyday objects was equally because these were the easiest objects to take out of Egypt without having to follow the partage system. So it wasn't really for the sake of everyday methodologies. It was mainly because they were quite light and small. They could easily leave the country unnoticed, which is extremely problematic. But today, every year, when it's either the birth date or the day he died, there would usually be such a commemoration of Flinders Petrie, and even the fact of there is a museum under his name, which is currently, this is being revised at UCL, the naming of, should we still call the museum the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology or not? Rarely is there any discussion of the racist science that Flinders Petrie was part of. This never filters to the public discourse. So even us in Egypt, we are taught about Flinders Petrie, who is the father of Egyptology, but we are never taught on his involvement in eugenics, how he used to smuggle Egyptian skulls. And this is something at his own confession, and we're not making this up. To UCL to have these skull measuring exercises where we're trying to prove how the ancient Egyptians were far more Caucasian than how they were African, trying to make more links of Egypt, Europe, and the West, rather than the rest of Africa, using a very racist methodology of the physical proportions of the body, which is extremely racist. And rarely, it does exist in scholarship, but in the public discourse, never does this come up. Never do we have an event where we tell the public, actually, Flinders Petrie was racist. He did have a contribution to archaeological science, but he had a contribution to racism as well. That led, and this is the research that was later used by the Nazis. So that had a huge implication on people's lives, not only in Egypt, but throughout the world. This is problematic. And our way to do this was in creating this comic here, which is exactly, again, what has happened between me and Nasser. So I was telling him about, there is this archaeologist called Petrie, who is a very renowned archaeologist. He has contributed to a lot of the knowledge that we know about Egyptian heritage, about our Egyptian heritage today. So I'm saying our Egyptian heritage. Obviously, this is the moment that Petrie turns around and tells me, you mean our heritage. And then I would be embarrassed telling Nasser, well, some things are in his favor and other things maybe are not in his favor. And that was just our own way of bringing some balance to the discussion. And it was equally inspired by a case that happened for us in Egypt when the former ruler, Hosni Mubarak, who was the president that the revolution in 2011 has ousted at the time, and he was ruling Egypt for 30 years. But the moment that he died, suddenly he became controversial in the sense of, that's the sensitive transparency that we use, because in the Egyptian culture, it's very difficult to speak ill of the dead. Once he's dead, you can't really remember him. You just ignore his bad deeds. And that's problematic because this is a culture that we have inherited and younger generations are finding it very difficult. So when this happened, there was a huge debate within Egypt. And that was exactly the same time that we released the very comic. And the comic was inspired by the debate that was going on. How do we remember this dictator today? And for me, that was exactly the same case with Petrie. His racism doesn't deny his contribution, and his contribution doesn't deny his racism. why do we have to be picky? Why is it one fact and not the other? And this is usually the whataboutism that we get. And something like myself as an Egyptian, if I'm ever in a panel and bringing this forward, either about him or Amelia Edwards, who was in charge of exporting most of the Egyptian finds from Egypt to the world, and to the extent of cutting tomb scenes and cutting temple structures, she has caused far more destruction to the Egyptian heritage than any of the destruction that could have happened if these objects have stayed in Egypt. Because as you all know very well, given your studies, that context, archaeological context, this is key for any interpretation. But when I bring this forward, people tell me, oh, but how about, but she was a feminist. She brought justice to British females. She was one of the suffragists, but that doesn't mean much to me as an Egyptian. And also her being a feminist doesn't deny her destruction of Egyptian heritage. And it is this way of remembering, and it is this problematic history that we in Egypt have to live with today. And this would be the final comment I would use. But what is interesting is equally how we have inherited, as many of the previously colonized communities, you internalize colonialism unconsciously. You start to see yourself like how the world sees you, even though this is extremely biased, but you tend to adopt the very same colonial lens and you auto-colonize yourself. This is something that happens increasingly in previously colonized contexts, be it in Egypt or in India or elsewhere, that we adopt the very same colonial dynamics that we once had to revolt against. And I don't know if any of you knows the temple of Hatshepsut in El Deir el-Bahari. Okay, so the translation of the word Deir el-Bahari is the northern monastery. And interestingly, there was a Coptic monastery at the area where the temple is today. But Nabil, who is the archaeologist who was sent by the Egypt Exploration Fund to excavate the area, he totally destructed all of the layers of the northern monastery because he was keen on the pharaonic layers of this heritage. So he destructed the whole of the monastery, although we still call the temple of El Deir el-Bahari, but El Deir el-Bahari, or the northern monastery, doesn't exist anymore because of the destruction that Nabil has caused to it. And that is one of the legacies that we have inherited, that we as Egyptians, even as you've seen in the tourism ad, we are very keen on showing the world that we are ancient. We would see you in Giza. We would see you only in the pharaonic aspects of our heritage, to the extent that equally there are waves currently of destruction of Egyptian contemporary heritage and Egyptian Islamic and Coptic heritage. And this would never happen with pharaonic heritage. The Egyptian authorities have no issues with destructing modern or contemporary Egyptian heritage, but this would never happen because they would worry about the international outcry, and because of how this is very much of a tourism draw, because usually tourists would come to Egypt and your full program would be on pharaonic Egypt. Anything else that is Islamic or Coptic, that's an optional that you should buy extra to your program, but the program is usually strictly pharaonic. You would only see what Egyptology has constructed as ancient Egypt. And sadly, this is part of an auto-colonial legacy that we have inherited. And in this comic, so it's me walking with Nabil and showing him, I'll show you a different heritage or a different archaeological construction, El Deir el-Bahari, which is a Coptic monastery that was built in the 7th century AD. And interestingly, once I tell him that it's a Coptic monastery that was built in the 7th century, he goes on and destructs it. And he's telling me in the very end, in the last scene, so where are the pharaohs? And actually, this is what, when you read the archives, the negative attitude towards Coptic heritage by Nabil and by many of the other archaeologists, Petrie or the others who existed at the time, or the negative impression of any layer of heritage that is not what they perceive as pharaonic, the amount of destruction that happened to this heritage at the time is huge, is unthinkable of. And these are things that we tend to ignore. And we have inherited ourselves. And one way of us looking is that, or what I was hoping to bring with this is that I wanted also for those from a Western European background, when they see our project, not to think that we're trying to attack anyone. We're not here, we're not trying to make anyone feel uncomfortable. That is not what we are here for. We just want to initiate a dialogue. And part of initiating a dialogue is acknowledging also how complicit we could be in adopting the very same colonial narratives. And this whole project was created in order to reflect on how complicit are we on these practices that happened in the past, and how can we move forward in producing a narrative of the past that doesn't render communities invisible even in the past, because the way we reproduce ancient Egypt is equally as dehumanizing as it is for the contemporary Egyptians. And thank you so much for coming today and for joining me here.
Thank you, Heba. That was an incredible talk, truly. Thank you so much for that. And as somebody who works on Coptic Egypt, I really sort of felt your last point very, very strongly. I mean, my colleague Nick and I work at Philae.
Yeah.
And all I could think about was when they moved the island from Philae to the new island.
Yeah.
You know, there were all of these Coptic structures within the temple that were completely
wiped out,
and they weren't recorded.
Yes.
So as I'm going back through trying to find the Coptic churches that were built on that island, there's no record of them.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's I think.
And still happening up till today, sadly, yeah.
Yeah. So let's open the floor to questions. Anybody want to ask?
Don't be shy.
I've got so many questions going through my head. It was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you
so much. As Sabrina knows, I feel very fortunate to be involved in the project with Philae and also at Vidox as well. As somebody who's not a trained archaeologist, I'm more of a digital reality capture sort of person. I wrestle daily when we're working in Egypt with the structures of colonialism that I think many contemporary archaeologists are absolutely oblivious that they are.
Thank you.
And the number of times I have kind of ignorantly raised quietly questions with trusted colleagues like Sabrina and asking the question, how do we move beyond this? It would give me no greater joy than to work directly with communities, directly with colleagues in Egypt, without this troubling remnant neo-colonialism. You know, when I'm looking at Philae, I'm referencing the Napoleonic surveys of Philae. It's the only other best reference, but I cannot get away from the fact that it was created on the back of an invasion. And I think Sabrina might agree with me that on our last campaign in spring 23, one of the most fulfilling moments of ever having worked there was we were working on the roof of the Mamisi, and the director of Philae, the Egyptian director of Philae, and all the inspectors, they came up and joined us on the roof as we were working. And for that brief moment, there was no insulation of Egypt from us, or vice versa. And it was sort of a direct relationship that we're often having to tiptoe very carefully around the power structures of the post-colonial kind of control mechanism. I'm so glad I came to your talk.
Thank you. I'm so glad you came too. No, thank you for saying this, because it's problematic. It's heartbreaking how many think that you can study the past for the sake of the past and that's it. So it's fine to go somewhere and dig and go back, publish articles, and that's it. And you can build your whole career out of this and gain prestige and funding, and without giving anything back whatsoever to the people who live 5 meters from it, or those who this is their heritage as well, and also without reflecting that this is, for example, an opportunity that is not for everyone, as it's the neo-colonial system, for example. And I was just saying this the other day, it would never be possible for me to come with a group of Egyptian archaeologists and come dig just at the backyard here. We would never be offered the permission. Needless to say, we wouldn't get the visas to do this. So it's just, I think, people don't reflect on how being able to study other people's culture is a privilege that not everyone could afford. And you need to use this privilege first of all, you need to acknowledge that this privilege exists, which is something that I find people are oblivious about. They don't realize how they come and when you enter Egypt, you just get a visa upon arrival, something that I can never have anywhere around the world. You never think of how these dynamics, this is colonialism in your face, and you need to do something about it that is equally not just, which is usually sadly the case, not just coming and offering us training, but equally trying to reflect on what we can offer, the knowledge that exists in the country there and what could be done differently. And they are so invested in the existing power structure that they don't reflect on the fact that they have power themselves, because as they need to come and dig in Egypt, Egypt needs them to come and dig there for a variety of socio-political reasons that I don't really need to get into. But you've got power even more than me as an Egyptian. Especially, I have to admit that there are cases where an Egyptian archaeologist would really struggle to get permits compared to a foreign archaeologist because the neo-colonial system is there. But rarely do they use this power to bring any change, any social justice, even in the sense of making a small, tiny publication that is in Egyptian Arabic for the people who live around, or going and giving a talk to a school. You could be excavating in Egypt for 20, 30 years, and you would have never have spoken in a local school, tell them what you're just doing there. Or you could go and excavate in someone's field, agricultural field, as is usually the case in Egypt, particularly in the Delta. You would do archaeological surveying. And people were very generous and the hospitality is part of the culture, but you don't see the extraction in the sense that you go seek the farmer and ask him for a permission and he allows you, and you never even explain to him what is it that you're doing. This is problematic. That's not something that you do here. Why do the same ethics stop to exist once you're out in the field in another country? So thank you for what you said, and thank you for acknowledging this, because sadly, I think this positionality very rarely, and there is a huge pushback against work like this, or anyone who reminds people of the persistence of colonial dynamics.
Well, I raised my hand.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I was wondering about the disconnect between like the ancient history and the modern experience in Egypt. And I was comparing it to what we do in Byzantine and Hellenic studies, and how those are told like in modern Greek history, because from the 19th century onwards, to create like a cohesive national narrative, like the Romanness of the medieval period will be neglected. Because they want that like overarching national connect from like ancient Greece to modern Greece. I was wondering if this is also the case in Egypt, where history produced in Egypt, how has it depicted like linguistic and religious change, and had that story been like manipulated to connect the pharaonic history to the modern day?
Yeah, because there are two paths of knowledge production of the past in Egypt. There is the state narrative and there is the people's narrative. They don't meet usually, or they are done in isolation. And this is one of the issues when it comes with people saying that the Egyptians believe this and this, and the Egyptians do so and so, and it's usually the state. And it's not representative of the multivocality of the Egyptians, given how you don't have access to the narrative, or you don't have access to public discussions around it. But there is like extensive Egyptian scholarship, even in literature, like Naguib Mahfouz novels, etc., that you would look into the very various layers of Egyptian heritage, where you acknowledge the pharaonic past, but equally the other layers. Usually the narrative that is adopted by the heritage and some equal nationalistic movements that have been growing like massively recently in the past few years, and they tend to call themselves the Kemet movement. But then when you reflect on it, it's equally a response of how can't call it nationalism as such because it's a response for the absence of Egyptians from the narrative of ancient Egypt. So I understand where this has come from because this is equally the issue. So when people try to do it, they are just trying to assert their position to make sure that they are heard, particularly that currently Egypt is in a lower economic socio-political status than how it was, let's say, in the 70s or in the 80s among the Middle East and North Africa. So it's starting to lose its regional position. So they feel that what could bring back Egypt to its regional position is its ancient past that is not related to the rest of the Middle East. That is something that they can claim as theirs, but it couldn't be shared with the rest of the region that could make them distinctive or could bring them more centrality. But that has to do with the economy and with the politics. It's quite mixed, but one of the issues also is the language barriers. Most of the knowledge produced in Egypt just doesn't filter into the rest of the world because it's in Arabic. So all my reading lists studying Egyptology, they never included an Arabic reference. They never included an Egyptian reference, even in Egypt, because we have adopted that's the auto-colonialism. We tend to perceive any scholarship that is Western is far superior, and we adopted the objective, rigorous science of the West, ignoring the subjective indigenous knowledge that makes local ways of seeing, doing far more valuable when it comes to local heritage than just the objectivity, which is not really true because no one could be objective, if I can say so. So, yeah.
Yeah, this has been really fascinating. My mind's going in about a million different directions. So I'm super interested in how people get first introduced to ancient history. Like, how does the media that you consume as a child affect your perceptions later on? And I feel like a lot of the Western obsession with Egypt comes from what we're fed as kids.
Yeah.
Like, I think ancient Egyptian stuff was the first time I had any sort of concept of what history is. It was definitely the first time I was introduced to archaeology, like when I was about 6. I got this little play set for Christmas that was a block of like compressed sand and a little chipping tool, and it had a little plastic Egyptian thingies in, and you could dig it. I loved it. It's one of the reasons why I'm here today. But I was wondering, like, what do you think about that kind of Egyptian cultural machine for children in the West and how it affects Egyptians here like today?
It's not the same for us in Egypt because most of museums or ancient, but apart from the pyramids, because it's seen as a place where you go for an excursion or a lovely family day out for the Egyptians, but we tend to see ancient Egypt, or it is produced to us as a sense, and this is for the tourists. It's not really for us to enjoy. It's mainly for the tourists, and our responsibility is to make sure that it's kept safe, sound, and clean and sanitized for the visitors who come because our economy relies on it. And even in our education, we get to know very little about ancient Egypt growing up. And given the economic situation, not all schools could afford having trips to museums, although there are attempts, like there are many local initiatives that try to make sure that the heritage becomes accessible for younger generations, but it's not something that could be done throughout the whole nation because of the state of the economy. And usually it's more modern history has the larger portion of what we learn about our heritage than our history at school, let's say, rather than ancient Egypt. So even an exercise we've done with the project where, because of how, as you say, in the West, ancient Egypt is your first encounter with history. So there will be the British school kids, they could identify objects from ancient Egypt in a glance. Like they would see, for example, shaptis, and you would show them and they would tell you, this is a shapti. So they know, like, even particular objects. If you do the same exercise with the Egyptian students at the same age, they wouldn't manage to recognize what it is. They would see it as, they know ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the very big structures or constructions, but it's not object-based learning that we receive, so they wouldn't be able to immediately recognize pieces of Egyptian heritage, as is the case here, sadly. And again, that's part of, it's what we've inherited.
It's fascinating, and hopefully it'll change
Yeah,
within our
hopefully, yeah.
lifetimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the astonishing talk.
Thank
I have a question about the role of public archaeology in Egypt. I know someone who worked at Sudan trying to work with the community and provide the outfit that's accessible to the community members, like for instance, publishing books for the children and.
Is it Tumomi? Tumomi? Is her name Tumomi?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I know her. Yeah, I know of her work. I know her very
I'm
well.
really curious, like, if there are like many other public archaeology projects in Egypt, and like, or like, if they're still like kind of concentrating on the colonial heritage or like other periods as well.
Yeah, there are some of the archaeological projects now in Egypt do have this community engagement aspect to it, which is it's a welcome change, but sadly it's also tied with how currently, if you have a community section of your project in your funding application, your chances of getting the funding is higher. So that always brings the question if this is a genuine interest, or if this is just because community archaeology now is a thing and we're doing it because we get funding. Because most of the time projects like this, again, as I said, they are designed backwards. So there would be a group of researchers in a university somewhere deciding, oh, this is an interesting site, we want to go and dig there, and then we have a conversation with the community, which is fine. But I think in order for us to decolonize or to disrupt the current colonial structure, I think it should be done the other way around. It should be first asking the community, be it of the archaeologists or the locals who live there, what would be of interest to them? What is it that they want to know? There must be a priority list of where to dig that comes from us as Egyptians or Sudanese or whatever, then it being a response to a project that already exists. And part of the problems with these projects also is that, again, they focus on a single layer of the heritage that is usually the ancient past. So you would go to a site and then you would be documenting only the pharaonic layers, but then the Coptic, Islamic, medieval, the modern heritage, again, it goes totally lost because it's not being documented. There is no holistic way of looking at the site. It's you only do a very tiny layer of it, ignoring the rest. And again, we fall into the same issue of loss of documentation, and that's loss of memories, like important knowledge for the people. So yeah, there are not as much as there should be. Not every archaeological project does have a community aspect to it, but there is. But I think this is like a welcome change, but I think we could do better.
Thank you. Sorry, I have a question.
Yes, sure.
Do you consider like we should call the work that work with and for by Egyptian people in the archaeology in Egypt as indigenous archaeology, or is that inappropriate?
Yeah, that's a problem that I'm having, because I see myself as Egyptian, and the only word that I know in English that makes me Egyptian, as in linked to ancient Egypt, is indigenous. But then I also know the baggage that comes with the word indigenous and how the word itself is problematic. I don't know of any other, and sadly, this is again the problem that we face. Even doing this work, you're usually confronted with the Western traditions of knowledge or terminology that you can't escape. There is no way around it. The way we define ourselves, usually there are wordings that we use in Arabic that could be translated more as a community of descent, because for us, it's the connection of the land, the connection to the land between us and the ancient Egyptian that makes us indigenous, or that makes a connection between us, not the genealogical links that is usually how indigenous is defined in a Western European setting. So we tend to refer ourselves as the grandchildren of the pharaohs. That's how people on a very public level, even between each other, they would refer to themselves that we are the grandchildren of the pharaohs. So if this counts as indigenous, then I would call it indigenous for the sake of starting a movement to include North Africa and wider Middle East into indigenous studies, because it's totally left out from wider settler colonial setting, although it is a very settler colonial setting, it just looks different.
Thanks so much. I find really striking both the similarities and the differences between the Egyptian and Greek case.
Yeah.
When you had the underwear picture and the pyramids, I was thinking of thinking from my apartment in Athens on the Acropolis, and how it's mediated through antennas and the mess of terraces, and so on and so forth. At the level of knowledge production, I think it is critical, and it is a major problem of all of our universities that we study ancient cultures detached from the modern societies on top of them. I mean, I try to nudge my students towards modern Greek, not just so that you can understand what a modern person thinks on the street, but also there is actual scholarship produced.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. Should be considering.
Yes.
I know detail is going to make it all easier to translate now with AI, but still, there's a difference though.
Yeah.
And no, I hinted at an aspect of that, in that powerful effort and success of the Greek state stitch together every part of its history and create this connection. And from what you described, this project did not succeed or did not articulate it in the same way in Egypt. And I'm not saying that we should be striving for this project.
Yeah.
And of course, the other fundamental difference is that despite the fact that both Greece and Egypt play a constitutive role in a construction of a certain West.
Yeah.
Greece is within the walls, Egypt is outside the walls.
Yes.
And the reasons for that are interesting, and we should be discussing as we think about our common heritages and ways of studying them.
Yeah. I think so. I think we should start a movement of how, because it's exactly the same thing. Because once I was told how, in giving a similar talk somewhere else, not in Canada, that why is it that I see everything in the light of colonialism? Why do I hold such grudge? And then I told him, because that's my life. That's my daily life. I can't see, that's how my day-to-day. How else shall I see it? And it was someone who's Italian who told me, so does this mean that us Italian do the same thing? I think it's also part of how people don't recognize what is that makes an empire and the colonial empire, even though they intellectually study those cultures, which is something for me that is quite problematic. That if you build your whole career on empires, that even if they are ancient societies, and you don't reflect on how you would need to trace the whole continuity or change up till modern time, for me it's very strange. I don't know how this is possible, because I was always astonished, like when I would enroll in my PhD degree in the UK, I was asked if I could read French or German, so I could be able to read the references, because most of the references on ancient Egypt are English, French, or German, but none of my colleagues would be encouraged even to learn Arabic or Egyptian Arabic. That is not part of the requirements of the course. And I'm amazed how that people find it absolutely fine that there is a wealth of scholarship that exists in the same country where they are interested in, that they're not looking at all. And for me, that's against the conception of rigorous science that is the West strives for, because rigorous science means checking all the references or being aware of all the knowledge that is produced on a single topic. But then they very consciously, and they don't feel guilty at all of totally ignoring everything that is produced that is just in a language that is not accessible to them. And when you think about it, there is an inherent, I think there is bias in there, because this would not happen with French scholarship or German scholarship or Italian scholarship, but it would happen with Greek scholarship or with Arabic scholarship. There is, I don't want to say racism, but there is an issue there that people need to reflect upon.
And it's interesting because there's a fundamental difference, for example, from my experience.
Yeah.
And the impact factor situation in the UK.
Yeah.
I intentionally sent an article of mine and then went and published a translation of the book of mine in Greece, so that I'm present in Greece.
Yes.
And I'm able to participate in a debate with Greek scholars, of course, read English, that don't need me.
Yeah.
But also to reinforce journals that are there and open my book to a wider Greek audience too. In the UK, that would be more difficult.
Yes.
Because the impact factor
Exactly.
so critical for your career is structured so that it sends you to the same Western journal.
Exactly. Exactly, because none of the journals that exist in Egypt would meet the impact factor that is needed for the REF or for the research excellence framework that exists in Western European institutions. So the institutions are structured in a way that retains the same power structure and the same colonial dynamics. It's not structured in a way that is inclusive of the global majority. No, it's structured in a way that it only centers on certain parts of the world, which is the global north. That is where serious knowledge is produced, and this is where we should all be looking up to. That's a fact that I think we need to reflect on and recognize, because this is biased. This is strictly biased. Because equally the case of Latin America, or if you're an academic who is in Europe, let's say, and you're Latin American, and as you for the same reasons that you've outlined, you'd be publishing in Latin American journals. Again, you can submit it for promotion because they are not at the same impact grading that is allowed in these institutions. So.
Nick first.
Yeah, very quickly, I really appreciate what you just said, Dimitri. I mean, and dovetailing with the commentary about, Pharaonic Egypt versus contemporary Egypt.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've witnessed multiple times over just campaigns in Egypt, multiple times where I can see neocolonial assertion being oblivious to or drowning out the narratives if they would only listen to Egyptians' sort of inherited oral mutual understandings of being those grandchildren of the pharaohs.
Yeah.
We engage this in First Nations issues in Canada in BC. I've worked with indigenous communities on the coast where with climate change, there are things that are disappearing in the landscape that is so important to Egyptians too, which when they disappear, there will be no use for the language to describe it. And I think your point about the imperative of linguistic competency that is not just this racist sort of club of languages is potentially missing an entire dimension of Egypt.
Yeah, that's true.
We're not using a language that is
No.
capable of describing these things.
No. And it makes you reflect as if we're not producing any knowledge at all, which is unfair. Like, it's just, and that comes equally from even recently for something like the Rosetta Stone and the hieroglyphs, how it's only recently that people are discussing the Egyptian and Arab scholars' contribution to the deciphering of the hieroglyphs. And this is even faced with, again, a backlash. Like, that's not something that remains widely acknowledged. It would be said in the passing. There were Arabic or Egyptian interest in the deciphering, but it's all the glory of Champollion.
Yeah, all this, the stuff about language and the language hierarchy is so fascinating. It's like, I'm a Hellenist. I'm currently trying to learn modern Greek. And even among people who claim to be, decolonial, anti-racist stuff, they find out I'm learning modern Greek and I haven't put any effort toward learning ancient Greek, and they're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, so much of my work requires that I go travel to Greece and I read for research and stuff. I should be able to speak the language. Also, kind of ties into some of the stuff you were saying about privilege earlier, like I'm privileged enough that I was exposed to the ancient Mediterranean at a really young age, and that I can study history and everything. I shouldn't just go in there all monolingual and expect everyone to speak English.
Yeah.
That wasn't really a question.
No, that's okay. That's an important comment.
But just to add on what Nina's saying, as somebody who came to Egypt from sort of the Coptic perspective, and is only recently sort of actively doing regular field work there, it almost shocks me, Heba, that it's not a requirement, especially in Egyptology programs, that you learn Egyptian Arabic.
Yeah, it's not.
I mean, if you're going to be an Egyptologist and dedicate your career to that, you should not be learning French and German.
Yeah.
And Italian. I mean, your priority absolutely should be Egyptian Arabic.
No, that's not the case.
But it's not the case.
No.
And that's a travesty.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean. If you look at bibliographies of any books about ancient Egypt, there wouldn't be a single publication in Arabic. There wouldn't be a single one reference that cited as in Arabic. And it's humiliating because it just reflects that. But that's the same colonial construction, the same colonial lens, like all the knowledge that exists in Egypt is totally dismissed. And I think consciously, because again, as I say, rigorous scientific knowledge, as what I learned in the West, should be that you have to look at all the possible interpretations of a certain topic. And when you're ignoring a huge part of the world, then you're doing it deliberately. You're just saying that this is not important, that this is, doesn't count.
Okay, I think we should probably wrap up so we can get you and everybody who wants to join us over to Beercraft so that we can continue this discussion further. But thank you again
thank you
so much for
having
coming
me.
all the way over from Cairo.
Thank you so much. No, thank you.